Okay, so welcome to the next module. It's Dr. K here, and in this module we're going to review uh, renal conditions, renal blood tests that we monitor. We're going to talk about urine in this module, and we're going to review a number of urologic disorders. Okay, so I think it'll be an interesting module. Since this is an important topic to understand in pathophysiology. Okay, so let's just look at the gross anatomy of the kidney. So each kidney has about 1 million nephrons, and most of us have two kidneys, one on the right and one on the left, and they're located at the back or in your flank. Okay, so if you were able to reach your hand around and put your palm on your back, that's typically where your kidney lives. Okay, we call it the costovertebral angle, CVA. So each kidney is lined with a very strong capsule. Okay, it's almost like a saran wrap around the kidney, and we call it the capsule. I don't think it's named in this slide. And then once we get into the kidney, so beyond the capsule, we have the cortex, which is the outer part, and the medulla, which is deeper into the renal tissue. Okay, so the cortex is where some of the nephrons will be, and then part of the nephron will dive into the medulla. And finally, the nephrons will will coalesce together. So the million nephrons will coalesce together in their different ducts and become what are called minor calyces, and then major calyces, and then the renal pelvis. And then the renal pelvis will drain into the ureter, which will send the urine to the bladder. Okay, so you have a renal artery coming into the kidney, which is coming from your abdominal aorta, and you have a renal vein, which is returning the blood to the inferior vena cava. So really, the whole purpose of the kidneys is to have blood flow come into them, have the blood filtered through the 1 million nephrons per kidney, and then have the blood return, once it's filtered, in the renal vein and return to the circulation. And the filtrate, which is the fluid that's going to go through the nephrons, part of it will become urine and end up in the bladder for excretion. Okay, so that's the main anatomy of the kidney, and we'll go into a bit more detail as we go through other slides. Okay, so let's just look at the anatomy a bit more. So on the side of this image, you'll see that it says cortex and medulla. And typically part of the nephron is in the cortex and part of the nephron is in the medulla. And when I use the word nephron, I'm really referring to the glomerulus and then the renal tubule, right? And they all have a very similar shape. They start with the glomerulus, and then from the glomerulus, fluid goes into the nephron, and typically it goes into the medulla, comes back up out of the medulla, and millions of these nephrons connect in the collecting ducts, right? And that's where urine is going to make its way out to the ureter and then into the bladder. Okay, so the red are the arteries coming in. So at this point they're basically capillaries, and each nephron is going to get a little capillary or arteriole that's going to interact with the glomerulus, and the blood vessel is going to give up some solute, some fluid, to the glomerulus. And the fluid is going to go through the nephron and be processed. So the nephron is going to decide what it wants to keep, and then it'll become urine, and what it wants to reabsorb into the bloodstream. Okay? So basically what you have is arteries coming in, giving each nephron a bit of blood in the glomerulus. The fluid in the nephron is going to be processed, that we're going to talk about. If it remains in the nephron and gets to the collecting duct, most of that will become urine. If it gets reabsorbed in the nephron, it will go back to the bloodstream. And this process is happening in about 1 million nephrons per kidney. And then the veins will start to come together and become the renal vein, which is going to go back to the inferior vena cava with clean blood. Okay? So the whole process is the renal artery coming in, interacting with these 1 million nephrons, and the renal vein is going to come back with clean blood, and the nephrons will have kept the waste products and potentially some fluid, depending on the status of the patient, and will produce a certain amount of urine. Okay, so here's an image of a nephron, just like in the above slide, but just a bit more spread out. So you have your arteriole coming to the glomerulus, and it's going to give solute or filtration into the nephron. And then the efferent arteriole leaves the nephron, okay, because it's given up some fluid. And now the fluid is going to get processed from the glomerulus onwards in the nephron, okay? Large proteins and cells don't typically get into the nephron, okay, because there's a basement membrane there. So electrolytes, water, glucose, they all go through the glomerulus into the nephron. But large proteins such as albumin or cells such as red blood cells, white blood cells should never get through the glomerulus into the nephron. And we'll talk about conditions later where they do, and that results in certain disease processes. Okay, so as we go through the first part of the nephron from the glomerulus, you'll see that glucose is being taken back by the bloodstream. It's being reabsorbed. Amino acids, reabsorbed. Water is being taken back. Sodium is being taken back. So just because the filtration is in the nephron, it doesn't mean that the system can't return it to the bloodstream in a process called reabsorption. Okay, so there's a lot of reabsorption of electrolytes and glucose and amino acids that occur even once the fluid has made it into the nephrons. Okay, there's constant readjustment. And then we go down the loop of Henle. Okay, that's typically in the medulla of the kidney. So the descending loop of Henle, the ascending loop of Henle, and then the distal convoluted tubule that then results in collecting ducts. And collecting ducts will get distal convoluted tubules from many, many nephrons. Okay? So understand that the process of reabsorption is fluid or electrolytes or other molecules being taken back into the bloodstream from the nephron. The blood vessels can also decide that they want to give more into the nephrons that didn't quite get filtered at the glomerulus, and that's called secretion. Okay, so reabsorption is fluid coming back into the bloodstream or electrolytes, and secretion is the blood vessel putting more into the nephron. Okay, so say it wants to put more drugs that a patient's taking, or it wants to get rid of more hydrogen atoms or potassium. That's called tubular secretion. Okay, so you have tubular reabsorption, tubular secretion. Okay, and what's highlighted here is where aldosterone works. Okay, so aldosterone typically works at the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting duct. ADH, which reabsorbs fluid, typically works at the collecting duct. Okay, and you'll see that when we're talking about diuretics, diuretics work at different parts of the nephron, and they will stop absorption of certain electrolytes, such as sodium. And when you stop reabsorption of sodium, water stays with sodium, and you get increased urine production, which we call diuresis. Okay, so this is the basic anatomy of a nephron, and you have about 1 million of these. Okay, and we will talk about diseases of the glomerulus, where it becomes very leaky and leads to certain conditions. And we will talk about acute kidney injury, where the kidney gets injured by a number of different events. And we'll talk about chronic kidney injury, where over the long term, the kidney has just gradually lost nephrons and has become weaker and weaker and weaker. Okay, so let's look at the main functions of the kidneys. So keep in mind that nephron that we just reviewed, right? So how the blood goes to the glomerulus, filters fluid through the glomerulus into the nephron tubule, and then the fluid travels through the nephron and will end up at the collecting duct. But in the process, electrolytes are going to be reabsorbed, fluid's going to be reabsorbed, and there's going to be molecules that will be secreted into the tubule. Okay, back to the main functions. So the kidney regulates blood pressure and blood volume. So we've spoken about ADH, antidiuretic hormone, that controls how much fluid is reabsorbed at the collecting duct. We've spoken about aldosterone and how that reabsorbs salt or sodium in water. So blood pressure and blood volume are regulated by the kidney and hormones that act on the kidney. Acid-base balance. So the kidneys can secrete acid, H+, into the urine. They also make bicarbonate to go into the bloodstream to buffer the potential for acidosis, right? So bicarbonate is the buffering molecule produced by the kidneys. They regulate electrolyte concentrations in the serum. So for example, more sodium can be reabsorbed if necessary. More potassium can be reabsorbed by the nephrons if needed. So they're constantly being adjusted in terms of whether they're being reabsorbed by the nephron back into the blood or secreted by the arterioles into the nephron, depending on what level the electrolytes are at. Okay, so regulation of electrolytes, very important. Removal of waste. So the toxins that were in the blood or the breakdown products of metabolism get secreted into the urine, right? So they go through the nephrons, they don't get reabsorbed, and they end up in the urine. So removal of waste. Stimulation of red blood cell production in the bone marrow. That occurs because of erythropoietin, which is produced in the kidney. So if you have a weak kidney or kidneys, and you're unable to produce erythropoietin, you're going to have anemia, right? And that's why many patients with chronic renal disease have anemia. And regulation of vitamin D and calcium formation. So vitamin D is made in your skin with sunlight. Only about 20 minutes of sunlight is enough vitamin D production in your skin. So you don't need to be out in the sun that long to have enough vitamin D for the day. But that's inactive vitamin D. And inactive vitamin D is activated in the kidney, right? So because of that, if you have kidney disease, such as chronic renal disease, you cannot convert inactive vitamin D, which is produced in your skin, to its active form once it goes through the kidney. So you'll run into all kinds of problems with vitamin D and calcium in your bloodstream if your kidneys are malfunctioning. And we'll get to that when we talk about metabolism of calcium and vitamin D. Okay? Vitamin D is the most important vitamin, or is the vitamin that helps calcium get absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract, right? So it's a very important vitamin. It's actually not really even a vitamin because your body can produce it in the skin. So we've debated about removing it from the list of vitamins since you can produce vitamin D in your skin. That hasn't occurred yet, so we still call it a vitamin. Usually the term vitamin is reserved for molecules that are, or nutrients that are required to be ingested in your food to get into the body. But vitamin D happens to be made in the skin as well. Okay, let's look at water regulation in the kidneys. So what happens when the plasma volume or the water, let's say, decreases in the body? So when your plasma volume, because we're typically talking about the intravascular volume, okay, the fluid that's in your blood vessels. So when that is reduced, say because you haven't been drinking well and you're dehydrated, that's going to stimulate ADH release from the posterior pituitary gland. And that is going to result in increased water reabsorption in the kidneys back into the bloodstream. So it will increase fluid volume. That's perfect. That's exactly what you want to do if you're not maintaining proper fluid intake. And your urine will become concentrated. So the specific gravity of your urine will go up. It'll have more concentrates in it, right? And it'll look dark. What else will happen? The release of aldosterone, right? Aldosterone is released when the kidneys sense a low circulating blood volume. They release renin. Renin results in angiotensin II production through a process of enzyme reactions. And once you have aldosterone secreted, that's going to reabsorb sodium in water. Well, that's perfect too if you want to increase your circulating blood volume, right? Because by increasing sodium reabsorption, water will follow. And at the same time, aldosterone causes potassium to be secreted into the nephron. Okay, so that's what happens when your body fluid is reduced, such as in a hemorrhage or in dehydration. What happens when the water is increased in your bloodstream or in your body? So let's say increased circulating plasma volume. Well, ADH will be turned off, right? Because it doesn't want to reabsorb any more water. So the kidneys won't reabsorb fluid, and you'll produce more urine, right? And you'll have dilute urine. And I mean, you can test this if you want. If you don't drink for 2 days, your urine is going to become highly concentrated. And if we were to check ADH and aldosterone levels in your blood, they would be elevated. The opposite of that, if you consume tremendous amounts of water today, your urine is going to become very dilute. It's going to look very clear. And if we were to check aldosterone and ADH levels, they would be suppressed. Okay, so here's the water regulation by the aldosterone system, the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. So the kidneys will sense a low blood pressure or a lack of blood flow through the kidneys. They will release renin. Renin goes into the bloodstream and converts angiotensinogen, which is produced in the liver, it's just a protein produced in the liver, and it converts it to angiotensin 1. Okay? So now we have angiotensin 1 throughout our body, and we have an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, which switches angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2 just by chopping off 2 amino acids. And angiotensin 2 is an active molecule that is going to vasoconstrict your blood vessels. That's an important role of angiotensin 2. It's going to stimulate aldosterone secretion. And when you stimulate aldosterone secretion, what happens? You reabsorb more sodium and you reabsorb more fluid. Okay? And why is this process happening? It's because the kidneys are sensing a low blood pressure setting, such as a hemorrhage or dehydration, and they want to get your blood pressure back up and get you to keep fluids from your kidneys, okay? And so they vasoconstrict all the little arterioles to try and raise your blood pressure, okay? So angiotensin directly does 2 things: vasoconstricts your arterioles and stimulates secretion of aldosterone from your kidneys, from your adrenal glands that then work at the kidney. Okay? Okay, so what's the purpose of angiotensin 2? Well, angiotensin 2, remember, came about because the kidneys sensed a low blood pressure or a low blood flow through the kidneys. And they activated renin to be released, and then the whole process ended up with angiotensin 2. And what does angiotensin 2 want to do? It wants to get your blood pressure back up. It wants to improve your blood volume. So it's going to do a whole bunch of things to do that. So the first thing we spoke about is it's going to increase aldosterone secretion by the adrenal gland to act on the kidney to reabsorb sodium and water. It's going to stimulate ADH secretion. Why? Increase even more water to increase blood volume, right? It increases sodium and water reabsorption. Well, that's just through aldosterone. Okay, so it's kind of saying the same thing there. It's going to increase and it's going to vasoconstrict the blood vessels, right? So it's going to tighten up all the little arterioles so that the blood volume stays in the arterial side and your blood pressure is maintained. Okay, angiotensin 2 can increase heart contractility, and you'll see towards the right that it's vasoconstricting. So all of these things are meant to either increase blood volume through reabsorption of fluid or vasoconstrict the arteries to keep the blood pressure on the arterial side, maintain systolic blood pressure. Okay, so you can see how important blood pressure is to the body, because it has these symptoms to make sure that the blood pressure never goes too low. The body's going to try everything to maintain a normal blood pressure.